On Friday, February 6, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in the freezing winds of Nuuk, Greenland. Behind him sat a massive Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker firmly anchored in the strategic harbor. In front of him stood a delegation of prominent Inuit leaders, their presence validating the moment as they proudly sang the Canadian national anthem. Mainstream news outlets across the globe aired 15 seconds of the footage, called it a good day for Northern relations, and moved on. It sounds like a routine ribbon-cutting ceremony. It sounds like standard diplomatic symbolism. It sounds completely harmless. But what you are actually watching is one of the most calculated geopolitical counterpunches of the decade. Let me take you deeper into what the media completely missed. Canada did not just open a diplomatic office. Ottawa actively redrew the Arctic map to deliberately box out American territorial ambitions before Washington could even mobilize a coherent response. For months, the United States administration had been signaling a blatant desire to project American dominance over Greenland. The White House viewed the resource-rich territory as an inevitable acquisition, treating Northern sovereignty as an afterthought. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not send a strongly worded letter of concern to Washington. He did not ask for a bilateral working group. He flew directly to the contested zone. He secured absolute Indigenous alignment, recognizing that Inuit presence predates any colonial border and provides supreme moral authority. He parked Canadian maritime security assets squarely in the path of anticipated American expansion. Most people watched that broadcast and saw a polite northern neighbor doing polite diplomatic work. They completely missed the reality. Canada just told the President of the United States that the board has been flipped and the game he thought he was playing has entirely new rules. This was never about a single building in Nuuk. This was the opening maneuver in a meticulously planned strategy to dismantle American assumptions of supremacy in the Northern Hemisphere. To understand why this maneuver is so devastating, you have to look at the last half-century of North American history. For 50 years, the United States treated Canadian resources as an unquestioned right. American politicians viewed Canada as a reliable, quiet gas station with a flag. Canadian leadership smiled, accommodated Washington, and played the role of the polite junior partner. During the fierce free trade debates of the 1980s, Ottawa absorbed intense domestic anxiety to secure market access. Throughout the North American Free Trade Agreement, negotiations of the 1990s, Canada accepted subtle insults and unequal compromises to keep the continental peace. Mainstream historians and political analysts call this a necessary submission by a middle power. They argue that Canada had no choice but to fold to American economic gravity. Let me show you what was really happening behind the polite smiles. While Washington was burning through its global geopolitical goodwill on endless foreign interventions, Ottawa was quietly executing a massive generational strategy of calculated patience. Every moment of supposed Canadian weakness was actually a strategic stockpiling of lethal economic leverage. Canada was not just digging resources out of the ground. It was building highly specific, indispensable regional monopolies designed to create absolute American dependence. Look at the architecture of this leverage. Alberta concentrated its massive oil and natural gas infrastructure to become the absolute backbone of the American energy grid, ensuring that any disruption would instantly paralyze the American Midwest. Quebec systematically developed an aerospace and critical mineral sector that the United States defense industry literally cannot function without today. Ontario integrated its automotive manufacturing so deeply into the American supply chain that detaching it would immediately halt production lines in Michigan and Ohio. Saskatchewan weaponized its immense agricultural and potash output to ensure that global food security and, by extension, American domestic stability relied entirely on Canadian exports. Each region cultivated a unique, devastating leverage card. Canada was not a fragmented nation competing internally. Canada was building a diversified continental-scale arsenal. The United States grew incredibly complacent, believing this seamlessly integrated system was a permanent American entitlement. But global dynamics have violently shifted. The timeline is critical here. As of April 25th, 2026, Switzerland and the European Union will completely ban the purchase of Russian liquefied natural gas. This geopolitical fracture creates a massive, immediate supply vacuum in the global energy market. Suddenly, the entire Western world desperately needs secure energy, and the United States desperately needs to maintain its domestic stability amid global chaos. This is the exact moment the Canadian trap snaps shut. Canada currently controls the absolute supply of 6 critical resources that directly power the American industrial base. Ottawa dictates the flow of oil, natural gas, electricity, steel, aluminum, and lumber to the southern border. The polite neighbor next door spent 5 decades allowing America to become utterly, irreversibly dependent on Canadian stability. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not panic when the White House began threatening the bilateral relationship. He recognized that the infrastructure for retaliation was already built, funded, and fully operational. The payoff for 50 years of Canadian strategic stockpiling has finally arrived, and the leverage is absolute. But a trap is entirely useless unless the adversary willingly steps into it. Ottawa possessed the leverage, but Canada needed a catalyst. Canada needed Washington to make a fatal error, an overreach so aggressive and undocumented that it would provide Ottawa with the ultimate moral justification to finally unleash this economic weapon. For decades, the mainstream media conditioned the public to view friction between Ottawa and Washington as simple economic disagreements. They called them trade disputes, tariff battles, or diplomatic misunderstandings. That framework is completely obsolete. Donald Trump did not initiate a standard trade dispute with Canada. He launched a direct, calculated, and existential assault on Canadian national sovereignty. To understand the sheer magnitude of this aggression, you must examine the exact timeline of events. The media reported the threats as isolated incidents, but when you align the dates, a terrifying systematic pattern of hostility emerges. In late January, the White House issued official statements praising the deeply integrated North American economy. Exactly 1 week later, without any fundamental shift in global market conditions, the President of the United States publicly threatened a devastating 100% tariff on all Canadian goods. The administration praised the bilateral relationship 1 week and brutally punished it the next. But the aggressive economic threat was merely a smokescreen for a much darker, calculated diplomatic maneuver. While the mainstream press obsessed over the tariff announcements, the Financial Times exposed a massive, unprecedented breach of international protocol. The publication revealed that the administration of Donald Trump was actively conducting direct, undocumented meetings with far-right Alberta separatists. They did not use diplomatic back channels. United States officials met face-to-face on multiple occasions with factions whose explicit goal is to fracture the Canadian Federation and attach Western provinces to the American Republic. Let me take you deeper into what that actually means. Foreign Policy magazine published a detailed analysis drawing an explicit and undeniable parallel. A global power seeks to expand its territorial influence by deliberately inflaming nearby separatist movements. It uses economic extortion to weaken the central government while cultivating regional rebels. Those are the exact annexation mechanics that preceded the crisis in eastern Ukraine. The only difference is that the power executing the playbook today is not Russia. It is the United States of America. If you doubt Washington's willingness to redraw sovereign borders, look directly at their current diplomatic posture. United States envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner recently led peace talks in Geneva regarding the European conflict. During these negotiations, the American delegation openly signaled a willingness to force territorial compromises on sovereign nations to secure short-term political victories. They demonstrated to the entire world that the current administration views international borders as entirely negotiable commodities. Canada watched this aggressive diplomatic posturing and instantly recognized the existential threat. When a supposedly allied superpower treats your sovereign borders as a suggestion, it is no longer a trade dispute. It is a survival-level crisis. Canada also recognized that raw size no longer guarantees victory. The Ukrainian military recently provided a masterclass in modern asymmetric warfare. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces obliterated a Russian S-400 Triumph surface-to-air missile system in occupied Crimea. They completely destroyed a $1 billion flagship asset alongside its Pantsir S-1 close-range defense shield using highly agile asymmetric drone strikes. Ottawa absorbed this lesson immediately. Traditional advantages in sheer bulk and military hardware can be permanently neutralized by technologically integrated, highly adaptable forces. Canada does not need to match the United States plane for plane or tank for tank. Canada simply needs to weaponize its asymmetric advantages to cripple the American machine. This documented pattern of American hostility crossed an unforgivable red line. Because the President of the United States decided to actively cultivate Canadian separatists, ignore sovereign borders, and threaten the economic stability of the continent, Ottawa gained absolute moral justification. The Canadian government no longer needed to play the role of the polite, accommodating neighbor. The threats provided Ottawa with the total moral permission required to unleash an unprecedented economic and strategic response. Canada completely inverted the power dynamic by operationalizing a massive, fully funded countermeasure architecture. Ottawa did not scramble a reactive defense. Ottawa deployed a systematic, lethal decoupling. The scale of this Canadian response is staggering. Ottawa finalized a historic $62.7 billion defense budget, but the headline number is not the real story. The real story is the strategic reallocation of those funds. Canada immediately and deliberately diverted $2 billion of that funding entirely away from American defense contractors. For decades, the Pentagon assumed that Canadian defense spending would automatically flow south to enrich American corporations. Canada shattered that assumption overnight. Here's the exact mechanism behind that $2 billion pivot and why it is so devastating to Washington. By redirecting those specific funds to European and British defense partnerships, Canada technically severs the Pentagon supply chain reliance. Historically, the Canadian military relied on American aerospace and defense giants for proprietary parts, software upgrades, and maintenance contracts. That structural reliance gave Washington a functional kill switch over Canadian defense readiness. The new funding architecture directly finances domestic and European production of those exact critical components. By integrating with European procurement frameworks, Canada creates an independent parallel supply web. This mechanism permanently eliminates Washington's ability to hold Canadian military supply lines hostage. This defense decoupling mirrors the ultimate blueprint for national survival. The Ukrainian drone manufacturer Ukrspec Systems recently opened production facilities in the United Kingdom. They did this specifically to bypass vulnerable domestic infrastructure and secure their manufacturing base against unpredictable disruptions. Canada's executing the exact same strategic principle on a macroeconomic scale. Ottawa is deliberately moving vital defense manufacturing and procurement away from unpredictable American supply chains. The Canadian government recognized that relying on the United States for security technology is now a critical vulnerability, and they are ruthlessly closing the gap. Simultaneously, Canada launched a massive trade diversification offensive to completely isolate the American market. In a matter of months, the Canadian government locked in 12 new trade and security agreements across 4 continents. This was not a desperate search for new buyers to replace American consumers. This was a calculated, aggressive strategy to systematically bypass the United States entirely. Canada established comprehensive strategic partnerships with the European Union. Ottawa accelerated negotiations with Indo-Pacific nations, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the Mercosur bloc in South America. Canada currently controls the absolute supply of 6 critical commodities that directly power the American industrial base. Ottawa dictates the continental flow of oil, natural gas, electricity, steel, aluminum, and lumber. By building a redundant multi-continental trade web, Ottawa ensured that every single barrel of oil and every single ton of steel has an alternative eager buyer in Europe, Asia, or South America. This infrastructure completely neutralizes American tariff threats. If Washington attempts to tax Canadian goods, Ottawa can simply redirect those goods across the Atlantic or the Pacific. The nuclear option of cutting off American access to vital Canadian resources is no longer an abstract theory discussed in academic policy circles, because Canada secured 12 alternative global markets. The threat of starving the American supply chain is now a fully viable, heavily funded, and completely operational reality. Canada successfully built an impenetrable fortress of geopolitical alternatives equipped with the exact mechanisms needed to starve the American industrial base at a moment's notice. But a weapon of this massive magnitude requires a very specific type of operator. An architecture this complex and devastating cannot be wielded by a charismatic politician or a reactive populist. It requires a mind specifically trained to view global geopolitics as a massive interconnected financial ledger. Mark Carney did not react to the social media tantrums of the United States president with panic. He did not issue appeasing statements. He did not attempt to explain the Canadian position to an aggressive White House. When the president launched insulting nicknames, Mark Carney used his silence as a weapon. Instead of matching the emotional outbursts, he responded with spreadsheet cold execution. To understand this response, you must never view him as a standard politician. He is a former central banker who understands the architecture of global leverage at a structural level that populist leaders simply cannot comprehend. His extensive background navigating crises at the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and Goldman Sachs means he views global geopolitics as a massive interconnected financial ledger. When insulted, the former central banker flew directly to Beijing. He returned with a highly calculated $3 billion trade unlock. Let me show you exactly how a former Bank of England governor actually thinks through this specific decision. This was not an ideological pivot toward Asia. This was the flawless execution of a central banker's risk assessment matrix. In this highly disciplined framework, a leader must weigh the catastrophic risk of a single point of failure against the calculated friction of engaging a systemic rival. The United States market represented an unacceptable single point of failure for Canadian exports. The matrix dictates that to neutralize a hostile primary buyer, you must immediately secure a secondary buyer with equal consumption capacity, regardless of political differences. By locking in Beijing, the financial architect artificially isolated the American market. He stripped Washington of its monopsony power. He applied a massive risk premium to American trade and aggressively diversified the national portfolio. He treated the United States president not as a commanding leader, but simply as a volatile risk factor to be mitigated. This is what happens when you send a central banker to do a politician's job. He weaponized his boring systemic expertise to outmaneuver Washington. He proved that systematic understanding completely dismantles emotional bravado. We are seeing this exact brand of technocratic ruthlessness deployed successfully by other allied leaders. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently secured a $145 billion loan for Ukraine by ruthlessly overriding internal political blocs from Hungary. She ignored the diplomatic noise, bypassed the populist obstruction, and executed the financial maneuver. Prime Minister Mark Carney applied that identical mindset to the North American theater. He bypassed traditional diplomatic hand-wringing to execute a pure leverage play. Canadian technocratic excellence is publicly humiliating American impulsiveness on the global stage. The contrast is absolute. The President of the United States posts altered cartoon maps on social media. The Prime Minister of Canada builds real devastating economic architecture. This calculated financial isolation naturally forces a permanent reevaluation of the bilateral alliance. The era of treating the United States as a trusted family member is permanently over. The trust is broken and it cannot be repaired. This is not an emotional overreaction by a frustrated neighbor. This is the official institutional assessment originating from the highest levels of the North American security apparatus. Listen to the exact words of retired Major General Scott Clancy, who served as the Director of Operations at the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The retired general explicitly stated that the underpinning of distrust is no longer emotional but factual. He declared that the alliance is shifting from relational to transactional. From relational to transactional, that single phrase represents the most significant change in North American geopolitics since the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When a former NORAD director delivers that divorce decree, it is an institutional fact, not a partisan opinion. He has access to the classified assessments, and he has zero electoral incentive to exaggerate. Think about what that means. Your closest ally is explicitly stating that the familial bond is dead. The relationship is now strictly business. A transactional relationship means that if the United States wants Canadian resources to fuel its economy, it pays the absolute premium. If the Pentagon wants Canadian aerospace components, it competes on the open market against European buyers. If you want proof of why this divorce is absolutely necessary, look at how Washington currently conducts its international obligations. United States envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are actively leading Geneva talks openly, willing to sacrifice the sovereign territory of allied nations to secure rapid political victories. They are brokering deals that reward aggression and abandon allies. The Ukrainian government clearly recognizes this betrayal. Kiev is now officially demanding the deployment of European troops on its soil, specifically to bypass American unreliability. Ukraine realizes that depending on Washington for security is a fatal vulnerability. Ottawa watched this exact pattern unfold and reached the identical logical conclusion. Washington is no longer a partner. Washington is a volatile, unpredictable variable that must be aggressively hedged against. Canadians have spent decades feeling obligated to support American initiatives, carrying the psychological burden of being the good neighbor. That burden is now lifted. Canadians no longer owe the United States loyalty, deference, or economic sacrifice. This official divorce decree liberates Canada to pursue absolute self-interest without a single ounce of obligation guilt. We are done pretending we are family. Canada is officially seeing other people, and the separation is irreversible. The only question remaining is exactly how much visceral pain this divorce will inflict on the American economy. The consequences of Donald Trump's provocations will not be confined to angry diplomatic press conferences or social media posts. They will detonate directly inside American households and heavy industrial centers, because the President of the United States decided to actively insult a sovereign leader and threaten the continental supply chain. American factories in the Midwest will face immediate crippling shortages of steel, aluminum, electricity. You cannot run an automotive assembly line in Michigan if Ontario cuts the power feed. You cannot build American infrastructure if Canadian lumber and steel are suddenly sailing across the Atlantic to European buyers. When Ottawa executes its operational plan to redirect Canadian oil and natural gas to these new global partners, it will trigger massive sustained price spikes across northern American states. This deliberate redirection will perfectly mimic the devastating energy shock that Europe faced when the Druzhba pipeline was compromised by military strikes. But this time the disruption is entirely legal, strategically calculated, and completely irreversible. American citizens will open their winter utility bills and discover the exact catastrophic financial price of their leadership's arrogance. They will suffer because their government assumed Canadian obedience was a permanent natural resource. While the American domestic economy begins to absorb this massive self-inflicted damage, you must immediately deploy specific personal resilience strategies to shield your own portfolio from the impending cross-border fractures. Do not wait for the mainstream financial press to catch up to this reality. First, aggressively reduce your exposure to United States consumer equities and retail funds, as the imported inflation will completely crush their domestic spending power. Second, deliberately shift capital into Canadian critical mineral and domestic aerospace firms that are currently actively securing European and British defense contracts. Third, lock in long-term fixed-rate debt instruments right now before the fracturing continental supply chains force North American interest rates into unpredictable defensive volatility. You simply cannot control Washington's erratic populist behavior, but you can absolutely insulate your personal wealth from its destructive consequences. Looking forward to the immediate future, you must track 3 specific operational scenarios as we rapidly approach the upcoming United States-Mexico-Canada agreement review triggers scheduled over the next 18 months. Scenario 1 is pure accommodation. Washington finally realizes the catastrophic mathematical cost of their leverage deficit, quietly drops the 100% tariff threats, and practically begs Ottawa to stabilize the continental energy grid. Scenario 2 is escalation. The White House stubbornly doubles down on populist rhetoric to satisfy its domestic base forces, a temporary border disruption, and Canada immediately executes the pre-planned European trade diversions, actively starving the American market. Scenario 3 is rupture. The entire continental trade agreement fully collapses North America, permanently fractures into competing economic blocs, and the United States permanently loses its preferred discounted access to Canadian strategic resources. Regardless of which specific path Washington chooses to stumble down, the underlying geopolitical reality remains completely unchanged. The era of the polite, accommodating northern neighbor is officially dead and buried. The United States is about to learn a devastating multi-billion-dollar economic lesson about the true cost of taking continental leverage for granted. The map of North American power is permanently redrawn, and Ottawa holds the pen. SEO description: Canada has just unleashed a radical geopolitical leverage to trap Washington's arrogance. Canada's latest move is not merely a diplomatic response. Canada is officially restructuring the entire North American supply chain in retaliation. Amid escalating tensions with Donald Trump, Prime Minister Mark Carney has weaponized dominance over 6 core resources to completely neutralize tariff threats. This video breaks down the systemic mechanisms behind severing billions of dollars in military dependence and how the industrial hubs of the American economy will suffer devastating consequences. You will understand exactly why the traditional alliance has officially collapsed, shifting from a relational bond to a cold, ruthless transactional agreement. Watch until the final minutes to grasp the 3 upcoming crisis scenarios and a specific roadmap to protect your personal wealth from this global economic shock.